Thank you so much, Professor Delaray, Professor Crew, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the great opportunity and honor to be invited to do this lecture in this series. I do not regard myself as an expert. You will hear perhaps in the lecture later on that I position myself on the not knowing position. So it's a bit of a paradox to do an expert lecture on the not knowing position. I'm also not sure that there is something like a non-theological audience. I regard you as a theological audience, all of you who are here. So thank you for coming. Baie dankie dat u almal gekom het. Dit is vir my 'n groot voorreg dat u moeite gedoen het en dat u hierdie tyd van die dag te midde van drukverkeer ensovoorts hier is om deel te neem hieraan. Thank you so much for taking the trouble and be here tonight. I hope that this lecture will give some food for thought and at least also a basis for further discussions. One day, I had to take my car to the garage for a service. And I was driven back in a courtesy car. With me in the car was another client, and both of us were taken to our workplaces. I was to be dropped first at the main gate of the university. When arriving at the gate, the other person in the car asked me whether I was working here, whether I was a lecturer, and then he wanted to know in which field I'm working. And when I told him that I am in theology, he said to me, "And how are you doing with the God problem?" I then asked him what he meant, and he said, well, the problem of how God is involved in the issues of life. At that point, I had to get out of the car, and that was the end of the discussion. But it gave me something to think about. What are we doing in theology? Are we working on what he called the God problem? If not, then what are we working on? The God question is returning today with a new sense of urgency. One hears much talk about the return of the religious. Debates on relations between the secular and the sacred are prevalent and arresting. Many speak of a religious turn in continental philosophy, or contrariwise, of an anti-religious turn in a new wave of critical secularism. Thank you, I've got water here, thanks. So, excuse me. Vital disputes about theism, about atheism, have not disappeared as some expected, resulting from the Enlightenment and subsequent declarations of the death of God by Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. The God question keeps returning again and again, compelling us to ask what we mean when we speak of God. The question is, how do we engage with these God questions? The traditional position for a theologian is to take a knowledgeable position. As the word theologian suggests, we have supposed to have knowledge about God. Theos and logos, the two words meaning God and knowledge. And therefore, we are supposed to give God answers. We have, after all, a God's eye view. But the world is changing, and we are changing with it. Theology is changing and has been changing through the ages. As theologians, we are much more reluctant to give answers nowadays on life questions than earlier. Now, in order to identify and understand these changes, we need to look at our current theological interpretation in the light of historical development. And therefore, the question where we are and where we come from. The developments of Western theology can only be understood in the light of and as part and parcel of cultural, philosophic developments in the West. In order to provide a quick overview of the paradigmatic changes that brought us to where we are today, we can have a quick look at 3 examples from the history of the painting of the human face. A medieval icon of Christ, a Van Gogh self-portrait, and a pop poster by Martin Sharp about or on the Van Gogh portrait, which will take us through the pre-modern to the modern and to the post-modern. The first one is an anonymous icon of Christ the Pantocrator. Now, these icons, of which this one is an example, were mostly the product of one of the Byzantine school of medieval iconography and were generally unsigned. The common practice of portraying the eyes of Christ as expressionless was a symbol of the main purpose of the icon, namely, to invite the onlooker to travel through the vacant eyes into the transcendence of God, rather than linger on the surface level of purely human expression and sensation. Church authorities effectively, in those times, discouraged experimentation with more expressive, realist or lifelike modes of painting. On the contrary, the self-portrait art form of the modern era lays the primary stress on the image as a medium of human expression. The sacramental prayer has turned into the existential cry. It's the words of Kearney. These self-portraits, Rembrandt, Van Gogh and others, represent a turning away from the traditional modes of painting resemblance, a mimesis of nature or God, to an autonomous expression of humanity. Even long before Van Gogh's self-portrait, the paintings of the Italian Renaissance were pointing in the same direction, humanist direction. El Greco's version of St. Maurice, for instance, received the following rebuke from the Inquisitor of Toledo. He said, "I like neither the angels you paint nor the saints. Instead of making people pray, they make them admire. Beauty inserts itself as an obstacle between our souls and God." And then the pop poster of Martin Sharp, the theocentric and the anthropocentric are replaced now by the eccentric. And parody. It is eccentric in the sense that the self-conscious subject is eccentric to itself and not functioning as the controlling origin of self-expression. Sharp's image of Van Gogh's self-portrait is confusing and paradoxical. One doesn't know whether to regard it as art or pseudo-art, which is in itself an indication of its postmodern character. On the one hand, there is a resemblance with medieval icon art, with its impersonal and formal expression. On the other hand, it is totally different in that it does not seek to direct the onlooker's attention towards some transcendent being, but only to be a playful item of popular consumption. The artist becomes the bricolier, someone who plays around with fragments of meaning which he himself has not created. The artist becomes a player in a game of science, an operator in an electronic media network. Now, these images represent cultural, historic stages, phases, which can be referred to also with the words paradigm shift. Now, in an effort to translate these developments into theological paradigmatic developments, these art forms can also be of use to us. And what I'm going to do now is to, on the basis of George Lindbeck's models of theology or typology of theology, on the basis of that, again look at those images and just make a few comments on how the theological development went. Because, of course, that's all linked to each other. George Lindbeck, publication in 1984, identified three models in order to explain theological development up to the present. The propositionalist model, the experiential expressionist model, and the cultural linguistic model. The first one, the propositionalist model, is a label for all of traditional orthodoxy as well as some forms of new orthodox theology. According to this model, the propositions of theology, which things like the confessions, other formulations, are thought to correspond directly to what is real and true. Sorry, it's that one. So, this model of Lindbeck seems to correspond with that art form, an expression of a certain phase in history, cultural, philosophical development. So a kind of theology that corresponds directly to what is real and true, through the eye to what's behind that, what's true. They simply describe what is. For instance, the proposition of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is not understood in this metaphor or in this paradigm as metaphorical, but as a description of who God is. And behind the eyes of the icon, there is a truth that can be captured and theological with certain theological propositions. Therefore, the real work of theology, according to this, is the articulation of propositional truth, whether in preaching, pastoral care, counseling, or any other field of ministry. You know what the truth is, you convey it. Now, the experiential expressionist model of Lindbeck corresponds with the Van Gogh self-portrait. This model represents a significant shift from the other one. According to this understanding, theology is the expression of the common core of human experience. Theology becomes more dependent on art, poetry, and aesthetics than on scientific statements in this paradigm. The words of Lindbeck, the structures of modernity press individuals to meet God first in the depths of their souls, and then, perhaps, if they find something personally congenial, to become part of tradition or to join a church. It is not difficult to understand that this will leads the way to a dominant individualism, and the dominant individualism of our time, and a next step to secularization. The cultural linguistic model of Lindbergh says, and I think you will recognize something of these things that he's saying in that image. He says it is not primarily, the theology here is not primarily an array of beliefs about the true and the good. Rather, it is similar to an idiom, a language, that makes possible the description of realities, the formulations of beliefs, and the experiencing of inner attitudes, feelings, and sentiments. It's like a culture or a language. It is communal, a communal phenomenon that shapes the subjectivities of individuals rather than being a manifestation of these subjectivities. Now, this new paradigm shift, which can be seen in these images, usually is referred to with the broad term postmodernism. And the poster image exhibits something of the parodic, paradoxical, multi-layered, and complex nature of this worldview. The term postmodernism is clearly an opposite, a response, a deconstruction of the certainties of the past. Both the propositional truths and the subjective expressions of the so-called core of human experience of the past are questioned and deconstructed with parodic art as an important communication vehicle. Now, theologically, we can refer to this as a paradigm shift away from what can be called foundationalism to anti- or non-foundationalism. Foundationalism takes its point of departure that there is an absolute truth and that it is available, that truth is available, can be accessed through thorough research. The truth represents the God's eye view, and that God's eye view can be understood, described, accessed. On the contrary, anti- or non-foundationalism can be regarded as the opposite, where the previous approach works with the ideal of a universal position that provides the answer to all problems. This approach takes it for granted that foundations or fundamentals don't exist, and that we only have a diversity of opinions, as expressed in this pop poster. The question is, where are we now? Thinking that Sharp's pop poster was produced in 1968, and Lindbergh's publication with his description of the theological models was published in 1984. Now we are 2011, 12. Are these descriptions and images still representative of our current cultural, philosophic, and theological paradigm? That's the question. Now, the answer is yes and no. Yes, because this new era has only started, and great paradigm shifts do not occur overnight. But no, because the very nature of this new era is that it consists of ongoing, rapid transition. The power of globalization is so strong and the current is moving so fast that we cannot even oversee the transition taking place. Theology, with its age-old foundational paradigm, is still trying to recover from the shock waves of postmodernism. Theologians are so well trained in the business of propositions that the anti-foundational or the relativistic trends of postmodernism remains a strange environment, and we are struggling to adapt to it. With this process of adapting to new times and ideas, one of the most exciting developments in philosophy and theology is what we can refer to as a third way, which is different from the foundational approach and different from the relativistic postmodern approach. This third way is known as the post-foundational approach. It is and you find that in philosophy and in theology. This third way is then post-foundational. It is an effort to move beyond the modernistic boundaries of practical theology, in our case, as a very formal, rationalistic venture. On the other hand, it is also an effort to avoid the relativism of anti-foundationalist theories. Now, in order to explain this practical theological paradigm, I found myself more attracted to the poster image of Sharp than any of the others. My theology finds itself better in this third image, I must say. But on the other hand, I am a bit dissatisfied with that because it is not capturing the basic understanding and approach of so-called post-foundational theology or practical theology. Therefore, one of the newer emerging forms of art provides us with an enlightening metaphor. That is land art or installation art. And I want to share one or two images with you. This is the Gates, so-called, is the name of the artwork, by Christu and John Claude, a Bulgarian and a French artist who worked together, known as Christu and John Claude. And they created this installation art in Central Park, New York City. 500 miles, no, let me try again, 500 gates of material and 37 kilometers of pathways in Central Park. The exhibit ran from February 12 to February 27, 2005. And the image of colored prayers in Stellenbosch, one of the lanes in Stellenbosch. Colored prayers is the creation of Jacques Coetzer, 2011, and the inscription down the wall says, you can't really read there, I will read for you. It says, "A drive through the countryside is often meditative, with mountain, field, and sky drifting past. Occasionally, a flash of color will signal domestic life. Washing hung out on a fence outside a homestead or laborer's cottage. Merely blown about strings of brightly hued clothing connect people and landscape, and so the very ordinary and intimate becomes public. Clotheslines, like prayer flags, can be imagined to send out personal meditations on the wind." These images provide a backdrop against which we can start to imagine the meaning of post-foundational practical theology or narrative theology, or post-foundational practical theology as narrative theology, theology as story. I would like then to use the rest of this lecture to unpack my understanding of practical theology as a story of doubt and imagination against the backdrop of these images. First, I want to talk a little bit about theology as story. Question can immediately be asked, what is new about this? Story has always been part of theology, and the knowledge and insight about the role of stories in our Bible and in theological developments are not new. It is for anyone to see that most of the Old Testament is a narrative a story account of the history of Israel. The same is true of the great sections of the New Testament, and Jesus, as we know, was a storyteller par excellence. So story is not new to theology, and yet narrative theology is something new and different. Let's revisit the artwork images again and reflect a little bit on how story was and is perceived and used in different theologies. As we have seen, this image represents what Lindbeck called propositionalistic theology. Within this paradigm, story is probably frowned upon except for the dominant story. Theology is about the truth. So that part of the story, that's welcomed. The one story, God's story. The story that must provide a view of God and which shouldn't distract us by any other images or stories. This story of God is, of course, carried always by a dominant and powerful story. The story of the judge, mainly, who owns that story and dominates that story. So, story was there, always, but it was used and perceived in different ways. The second one, when looking at this image, we think of the experiential expressionist theological paradigm, where theology is understood to be the expression of the common core of human experience, and therefore becomes more dependent on story. Story as an expression of human experience becomes a valued object of study within this metaphor. We can refer to this interest in story in this paradigm of theology as narratology, knowledge of stories, knowledge of narratives, as a way of theological understanding. The story becomes an object of study and interpretation. In the third image, theology that goes with this is Lindbeck's cultural linguistic model. Here we think of a collage of stories, all on the same level and each in its own right. The typical postmodern approach of your story and my story. In contrast to the one story of the first image, the story of truth, the multiple stories, all equally relative to the truth, and those multiple stories now comes to the fore. Story does no longer carry the objective truth, but becomes the expression of subjectivity. We can also refer to this as constructivism. We can, with language and story telling as major instruments of constructivism. Now, in the fourth image, it's not about stories, but about storying. And that's the major shift and important way of trying to convey the difference between using stories and what we call storying. There's no such word in English, but this is a technical term to convey something of the process of telling of stories, storying. The important shift away from stories as such to the process of storying. This is a discovery that the whole of reality is like constructing an installation and walking through the gates of the installation. We construct reality on an interactive and social basis, and we refer to this as social constructionism, over against constructivism, social constructionism. Stories are a social product and they function socially. Within this frame of thought, God is also discovered as the storied God. God is not above history, but has a history, and God's history is part of our history, while our history is part of God's history. Our relationship with God is storied. As we walk through the installation of life, we story spirituality religiously and theologically. These last two images capture the ideas of post-foundational or narrative theology much better than the parodic and chaotic image of the pop poster. In summary then, the word story, narrative, when applied to theology, creates all kinds of misunderstanding and false claims. False claims. Story indeed features in theology through the ages and can be studied in and used in all subdisciplines. Stories can be studied from a variety of epistemologies. You can be totally positivistic and structuralistic in your approach and be very interested in stories. In that case, stories are phenomena, objects of study, which can be analyzed and interpreted. But what we are talking about tonight is something different. This approach is not about using stories in order to find data or to understand the context, but about being storied, about being drawn into the installation of stories. It is not about us telling stories, but about stories telling us, we can say. Narrative theology, therefore, is about the realization that stories are not only the means through which we give expression to our experiences, it is first and foremost the means through which we construct our experiences and our realities. Through the process of languaging, we form our stories, but in the same process we are formed by them. It is a never-ending process of storying and becoming and storying. Now, this knowledge has major implications for the way we understand and do practical theology. If we are no longer the objective experts who study our field, but if we are drawn into our research stories, and with our participants are constructing new realities, we are accountable on a different level. The criterion for good research is no longer objectivity, but rather subjective integrity. The question now is, how do we participate in this installation? How do we reflect on the clothes on the washing line? Now, I would like to share with you a couple of concepts which form part of the whole understanding of narrative theology. And I want to talk about doubt, paradox, embodiment and local, biography, autobiography, interdisciplinary participation, and then also ask the question about the relevance of this all. So, doubt first. Doubt as a leading metaphor for theology. Theologians are often perceived as the champions of certainty and belief. But the truth is that the more you dwell in the vicinity of the ultimate questions of life, which is per definition the task of the theologian, the more likely you are to become disoriented. Such disorientation, however, is a prerequisite, on the other hand, for the reaching of reorientation. I'm referring to Brueggemann. But this reorientation is not the same as regaining old certainties again. It is rather finding assurance in the creation of a new identity. This implies a new role for theologians at the interdisciplinary table. No longer as the guardian of religious tradition, but as the one that can formulate, on the one hand, the value of traditions, on the other hand, express doubts about those same traditions of interpretation. The second concept is paradox. To embrace paradoxes. A few weeks ago, the internationally known South African theologian Jimmy Loader delivered a lecture here on campus about what he called bipolar theology. In the lecture, he showed that you can find in wisdom literature this inherent bipolar theology. On the one hand, there is a wisdom of causality. In other words, if you do good, good things will happen to you. If you do bad, bad things will cross your path. But in the same breath, in those wisdom literature, in the same text, you also find the deconstruction of that same system. It's not working like that always. So it gives the system and it deconstructs it. It's a bipolar theology. So this is a message from the core of theological thinking, and yet when entering the public domain and in conversation with others, the theologian often finds it difficult to embrace this paradoxical position. We are more comfortable to carry with us the eye of certainty than to start a construction and installation with others. The implication of inviting a paradox and doing theology with a paradox is to be confronted with messiness and chaos. Things no longer fit in neat little boxes. This is therefore the root of diversity. It brings us to a place where we do not only tolerate diversity, but indeed embrace it. The washing line image provides us here with even a better metaphor than the very orderly land art of Christou and John Claude Gates, the Gates installation in Central Park. Daniel Kirk, professor of New Testament, theologian at Fuller, has a very nice description in his blog about theology and his kind of theology. He says, theology is about suggestions and questions. It's about thoughts clanging around that haven't found a way to resolve in some sort of palatable harmony. Like real life, it's a mess of happenings and thoughts and interpretations and rightness and wrongness. So that is about paradoxes, which is part of the narrative approach. And also part of the narrative approach is embodied theology. Now, the quote of Van Heijsten I will come to. I first want to share with you the anecdote, well known to my students and former students who are here tonight. You will remember this anecdote. The interaction between Hiltner, the practical theologian, pastoral theologian, and Tillich, Paul Tillich, the systematic theologian, illustrates this. Tillich was addressing an audience in a lecture like this, and then he wants to explain something and use an example, and he says, let us say there was this certain man, and Hiltner was sitting in the audience, and he interrupts. Hiltner interrupting, what was his name? Tillich, let's say John. So there was this man named John, and Hiltner interrupting again. Was he married? Tillich, let us say he was. So there was this man John who, Hiltner interrupting again. What was his wife's name? Did they both work? Tillich with exasperation. Professor Hiltner, won't you please let me finish? What is the meaning of all your questions? Hiltner, to speak of just any man is to speak of no man at all. The post-foundational approach forces us to firstly listen to the stories of people in real-life situations. It does not have the aim of merely describing a general context, but of confronting us with a specific and concrete situation. According to Van Heijsten, embodied persons and not abstract beliefs should be seen as the locus of rationality. We, as rational agents, are thus always socially and contextually embedded, and we can say embodied. This way of thinking is always concrete, local and contextual, but at the same time reaches beyond local context to transdisciplinary concerns. It is contextual, but at the same time in acknowledgement of the way in which our epistemologies are shaped by tradition. Van Heijsteen refers to the post-foundationalist notion as a form of compelling knowledge, which is a way of seeking a balance between the way our beliefs are anchored in interpreted experience. And therefore, another part of the narrative approach is biographical or autobiographical theology. It becomes clear then that narrative theology places the emphasis not so much on the dominant stories, but on the small, even marginalized, real-life stories. On the other hand, these stories can never be studied alone. They can only be understood in their relation to the meta-narratives of church and society. This is specifically challenging in the church environment. Because on the one hand, the cooperative, the church story, provides the safety and the space for the individual story to be embedded into a bigger context. On the other hand, there is a danger of a discourse becoming so dominant that it leaves no space for the development of personal stories. The problem is that church theologians can be more concerned with the narrative coherence or incoherence of whole traditions than with what makes a human life coherent. The challenge is to take both personal and meta-narratives seriously, but not to allow the dominant story to be heard alone. This brings us to interdisciplinary participation. Because all of this leaves the theologian in a kind of paradoxical equilibrium where we feel fragile but also find a new safety. The important fragile because we no longer have the God's eye view. Fragile in many ways, but a new safety. The important point is that the equilibrium is only to be found when we participate in the installation art of interdisciplinary work. Not on the basis of having God's eye view, but on the basis of being an equal partner, contributing to this installation. The theologian has to contribute to this interdisciplinary discussion and has a contribution to make where no one else can. The questions about God are asked everywhere, sometimes in obscure language. The recent discussion about the best name for the so-called Higgs particle or Higgs boson is an example. Although the title, God's particle, comes from the publication by Leon Lederman, The God Particle Universe Question, and although this was seemingly formulated to elicit a positive response from the USA Congress, it revealed something of the underlying question about God and the universe that surfaces often and in many ways in many disciplines. If theology can derail from the task of defending God and ask the real research questions with the other disciplines, it can participate in a meaningful way at the interdisciplinary table. Question now is, what about relevance? If theology becomes narrative theology and is conducted as narrative theology, and it's about the marginalized stories, etc., all those things, how can it be relevant? Now, the paradox is that the more exposed, fragile, and even wounded the theologian becomes in the interdisciplinary process, the more safety is experienced and the more relevant the theological contribution becomes. I would now like to conclude this lecture by illustrating these ideas on a very concrete level. I can refer to many research projects carried out by myself and my students that have been conducted during the last 20 years. I can, for instance, recall the HIV and AIDS project and many others Jacob Meyring sits there. He's working on embodied theology. Hopefully next year he will be the first or one of the first who will receive a joint degree from the University of Pretoria and the Free University of Amsterdam. So I could refer to many research projects represented here by some of my students sitting here at my own. In recent times, I have become more and more interested in the application of the narrative approach in community life. Some reflection on a project conducted by myself and my colleague, Professor Cas Wepener, would help to illustrate, hopefully, the paradoxical, fragile but safe position for theologians in an interdisciplinary arena. On the 12th of July this year, we read a paper at the Oxford International Conference on forgiveness. Now, first I would like to reflect on the conference and the context within which it took place, and then, second, on an aspect of that research which we reported there. And I want to reflect on that. I do this with the attitude of, this is installation art. So, I just ask you to join in thinking about this and the meaning of this on some real concrete issues also in our context. Now, Oxford is the place where theology used to receive VIP treatment. This is the place where the theologians, when receiving a doctorate, would be called first to the podium. They would not only be awarded a degree like all the others, but also receive a blessing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost in the graduation ceremony. That is the environment and backdrop against which we participated in an international interdisciplinary conference on forgiveness. Forgiveness is traditionally a theme for the theologian. But in this interdisciplinary conference, we were just equal participants. Interestingly, the traditional role of the theologian is to define and explain what the biblical concept like forgiveness might mean. That role was in this conference fulfilled by the others, the philosophers, the anthropologists, the authors, the psychologists. They were struggling with definitions and analysis about forgiveness. Our contribution, on the other hand, was practical theological in nature. We just shared the story of the praxis of forgiveness on South African soil. We brought a poem by Antjie Krog to the table, and with that, the story of the TRC. We even brought a very local story of a workshop on peace and reconciliation that was held in the small town of Oorigstad. And amazingly, our paper was valued as a meaningful contribution. The very fact that an interdisciplinary conference with no special place for theology was held at Oxford is in itself significant. Theology might still have the image of being very important, even at Oxford's graduation ritual, but in reality it has no longer any priority. On the other hand, paradoxically, it has found a new place, in our conference at least, fragile but safe. But this can only happen when theology is stripped of its power and when it can formulate doubt and questions about issues that once were specialized knowledge fields of theology. If I compare this to the first time I participated in an interdisciplinary meeting, the difference is that at the beginning I thought it to be my obligation as a theologian to bring something, way of interpretation to the table. This time we just brought a story with very little interpretation and instead invited the participants to interpret with us. In line with the metaphor of installation art, we installed something and invited the others to participate. It was storied practical theology. and storying practical theology. It left us fragile but safe. Now, second and lastly, then, I want to reflect on an aspect of what we reported on. We made the following observation about the way the Confession of Ballard was perceived by members of the local congregation of Oorigstad. Now, this is a quotation from our paper, and the paper refers to that workshop that was conducted in Oorigstad in 2006. I quote then, "One of the most surprising moments occurred towards the end of the discussions in that workshop, when the participants were asked to share negative memories and to voice their frustrations and disappointments. In spite of the fact that at that stage of the discussions, an open and trustful atmosphere had developed, the opportunity was not taken." The speaking of truth part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which the organizers of that workshop had taken so seriously, and the view which I, as the facilitator of the workshop, also shared with them, did not occur. Even when the Dutch Reformed Church delegates put the issue of the little contact between the communities and the problems around the acceptance of the Confession of Ballard on the table, the response remained the same. Now, just quickly, all of you might not be that well informed about the Confession of Ballard. The Confession of Ballard was accepted in Ballard by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in 1986 already, and later on became also confession, part of the confessions, one of the confessions of the Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa. And this workshop was between a delegation of the Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa and the Dutch Reformed Church in this small town of Oorigstad. Now, one of the participants was the Dominee, the Reverend Sipu, from the township there in Oorigstad of the Uniting Reformed Church. And he, when we came to this, the issue of the Ballard Confession, he simply emphatically stated that he is speaking on behalf of the majority of his people and that they all feel the same, and he says, Ballard is just a document and should not stand between us. According to him, Reverend Sipu, it's more important what goes on in people's hearts than just to accept or reject a document. The other black participants supported him in his position. Now, like interdisciplinary work, intercultural, intergroup, interdenominational discussions like the one there, leave one fragile but safe, my experience. The words of Reverend Sipu left us as participants of the conversation in Oorigstad in silent surprise. Up to that point, and even presently, Ballard has been surrounded by strong opinions from both sides. It is as if the theological paradigm within which it was written and received was one of truth. You can perhaps think of the first two images. Strong words were used, words like status confessionis, the state of confession, even words like heresy, the heresy of apartheid. It created strong opinions on both sides with accusations about ideology, politics, and more. In our workshop, we expected a similar kind of reaction. Instead, Ballard was reframed or restored, and an installation was put up. Installation art was the guiding metaphor instead of propositional confessional language. I am not saying that the strong and clear confessional language of Ballard was wrong or that it didn't contribute to the transition of our society. I'm also, on the other hand, aware of the many complicating factors in an environment of inequality and power-based relations that could have contributed to this position taken by Reverend Sipu. I am also aware of the North-South and other dynamics within the Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa, which influence the members' view on Bellaar. Nevertheless, we as participants of a low-key workshop in a small rural town experienced something of the power of the narrative approach to theology, which indeed left us fragile but safe in that specific context. This story makes me wonder and imagine how different things can be if Bellaar is not defended or attacked, as if it is the absolute truth or the non-truth. If it is not made powerless because of the idea that there are many perspectives and interpretations possible. If all participants can be drawn into the creation of a new story. Imagine an installation of a public washing line and a line, that place where we can all bring our colored prayers, our washing, consisting of expectations, fears, regrets, blame, shame. Imagine how different things can develop in such a storying process. In conclusion, back to the question of the other passenger in the car. The God question was answered in different ways through history. We can imagine a God answer in each of the images. With the narrative understanding, the fourth image, it might be different. But in each of those images, you can imagine that the God answer can be given according to that understanding. With a narrative approach or understanding, the God question is not answered. Instead, people are invited to take a walk in the park or a walk under the washing line, which would hopefully facilitate meaningful questions about God. I can imagine that when we do this, in participation with others, with humility, not knowing instead of being experts, with subjective integrity, with doubt, but also imagining new possibilities, that we will always be fragile but in a safe place at the interdisciplinary table and on the campus of the University of Pretoria. Thank you.